I love Sonny James. There's a lot of people on here that might not even remember who Sonny was. If you're a country fan, you'll remember him. He was, in the 50s and 60s, he had a massive string of number one hits. And he was a tremendously well-loved artist, a guitar player, a folklorist, translator of songs. Like he was just a great artist. I think they called him the Southern Gentleman or the Country Gentleman. He was just so well loved. He was a super nice man. And I actually met Sonny James in 1992, about the time I was working with Jerry and Tammy Sullivan, the Bluegrass Gospel Act from Mobile, Alabama. Well, Waggerville, to be technically accurate. Washington County, Alabama. And we went up there to Birmingham, I believe it was, to play the Alabama Country Music Hall of Fame. There was an installation of people that weekend in the Hall of Fame. And, of course, Sonny was already in there. But when we got backstage to rehearse and tune up for the show we were going to do, wasn't he sitting there? And I recognized him immediately. He was just a frail little old man in a windbreaker and jeans and cowboy boots, and he just sitting in the corner with he had a beautiful goatee, which he had never had before, I don't think. I'm not sure. I can't remember the early days of his career, but he had a goatee and his hair was all, done up, and he looked so cool, like, and he was talking to everybody. He was just sitting in the corner talking to people and encouraging everybody and saying hello to old friends and stuff. And I looked at Jerry and I said, "My God, that's Sonny James." And he said, "Yeah, that's Sonny James." And so I immediately went over and with my mandolin in my hand and introduced myself. I said, "Mr. Sonny, I wanted you to know that your guitar playing was the first thing that I ever noticed when I was about 4 years old as guitar music. And I learned Young Love when I was 5 years old and played it and copied your break." And I said, "I just want to thank you because to this day, you're playing on that one song and the solo you took and the things you did inside that one song still give me cold chills. I still hear it and go, wow." Like just the tone and the timing and his choice of notes. And he just looked at me. He's like, well, son, that's mighty fine. He says, I'm really glad to hear that. And where are you from? And so I told him all about where I was from. And I played in Nova Scotia in the 60s. And he told me all these stories about, where he'd been in Canada. And it was a magical, magical moment. And he stayed in there with us all afternoon. It was things like that really altered my life, meeting him. But the reason I wanted to meet him, and it goes back to my family unit and my brothers, Bob and Joe. They had the most incredible collection of vinyl and taste in music. And the album that started it for me with that one piece was a Sonny James record called, I think it was called BMI Number 1. And it was a collection of songs that Sonny did that had all received 1 million airplays on the radio. And so he did everything from I Walk the Line to his own song, Young Love, had received 1 million plays on U.S. radio. And so it was a really cool album. And of course, the first thing on the record was Young Love, because It was his song, and that album was my brother Joe's. He bought it because he liked Sonny James, I'm sure, but my mother was also involved in some of these purchases because she liked old country music. So records like that, and the Patsy Cline collection we had, and Jim Reeves, and the old guys from the 50s, she loved that music. So Joe would buy these records not only because he loved those old country songs, but my mother liked those artists. So being around my brother Joe was the only other one besides David that really took a serious interest in music. It became part of his life. And I think when he was around, I think he might have been around 20 years old when he finally bought a guitar. And he was working at a Gulf gas station in London, Ontario. And he was the only one left at home with me and my mother and my dad. So he was out, working, getting jobs, working best he could, minimum wage jobs. He went to college. He like a trade college. He went to Fanshawe University and got a degree in janitorial and maintenance and all this stuff. But for some reason, Joe never really was career-minded. He was survival-minded only. And so he made enough money to do the things he wanted to do and buy his stereo components and have enough money to do things with. And that was sort of where it ended. He was not a person that was inclined to go out and make $1 million. I just don't think it was ever part of his makeup. So he spent his time really involved in music. So when I was about, I couldn't have been any more than 3 years old, maybe. When he was about 18 or 19 years old, he bought a guitar and brought it in the house. And at that time, I was already able to operate the turntable. At the age of 3 and 4 years old, I was already like sitting on the floor cross-legged in front of the stereo system with headphones on, listening to records that I was choosing myself out of the collection. And when I was 5, early, just turning 5, I started to notice Joe playing the guitar. And he would go out to work at the Gulf station during the day, and it was summer, of course, and I don't even know I think I may have started school late. I can't remember. But I was home, and Dad was away working at in Kincardine. And so I was there alone with Mom, and so I started to sneak into his bedroom and open this case and fool around with this guitar. And this went on for weeks, maybe months, before I was finally caught. And so my mother was livid. She was like, "Oh, if he finds out that you were touching his guitar, he's going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. You can't, it's not yours. You can't touch it. It's not a toy." But they didn't know that I was actually in there playing it. And so I think what happened was, it's a little foggy because it's so long ago, but I think that at some point Joe looked at me one day, and I went in the room with him when he was playing, and he looked at me and said, "So can you play this thing, or are you just think it's a toy, right?" And I was barely 5 years old, and I probably said, no, I'm playing it. And I think I demonstrated an ability to play some chords that I had figured out on my own, maybe a D chord or G chord or something. And Joe immediately took me under his wing, and he taught me the basic chords, how to hold a flat pick, all these things, right? And then immediately at the age of 5, I was starting to try to learn things that I heard on record. And the first thing was that lick on Young Love by Sonny James. It's funny because there's the line is blurry between because it happened so early that I sort of branched off on my own, away from Joe's teaching, right? But he got me going. He got the basic stuff going. And then I wanted to learn Young Love. And I remember him teaching me how to play a bar chord, because there's a barred F chord in this song. And you have to have it in order to play the song. And I couldn't do it because my hands were small. I doubt that the action on these guitars was very good. And it was a nightmare. And I remember him showing me how to make a barred F and working on it for weeks. It was 2 or 3 weeks of struggling with this chord until finally one day I just woke up and did it. And which is amazing, which is a lot of I think what happens to most people who are applying themselves correctly and trying to learn an instrument. If you practice something enough and fail enough times, suddenly you can do it because your brain memorizes the failures and steers you away from doing them again until only positive muscle memory is actually retained. And that's one of the biggest things in how I teach people to play music, is how to create muscle memory and how to let your hands do the work and your subconscious do the work. So at that point, my relationship with Joe became inextricably entwined. He was he was my first hero because he was the only real male figure in my life. Really, my dad was there, but he was there so little, and there was problems with my dad because when my father was around, my mother would pick fights with him constantly. So, like, him being around in my child's mind was like, if his dad's here, it's going to mean more arguing and whatnot. And my father didn't argue at all. He mainly stayed quiet while my mother literally ranted and raved and broke things. And so Joe was sort of a calming sea in my life. And but the reason for that is tragic as well, because my mother didn't do him much better than she did anybody else. The story goes that when she was pregnant with Joe, she woke up in the middle of the night and had, I guess, what was considered, sort of like a partial miscarriage. She had a huge discharge in the bed that was abnormal, and she was 8 months pregnant with Joe. And she claimed she saw a giant hooded figure standing at the foot of the bed. And she believed in this stuff, but it was where she was from. Like all the people in these not all, but a lot of the people in these small communities in Nova Scotia were religious and also believed like in witchcraft and the devil and forerunners and all these, clairvoyance and ESP, and just, it was insane, some of the stuff that she believed in. And so when this happened, she, from that moment on, believed that Joe was doomed before he was even born. And she told him so as he grew up. She told him that because this thing had happened, that he was mentally handicapped from it. And imagine telling your child this, like when there was no evidence of it whatsoever. Because Joe is one of the most intelligent human beings I've ever met. He's a genius level person. artist. He can draw, he can play, he can write songs. He's a great singer. His sense of humor is incredible. He could have written for comedy. He could have drawn for comic books. He could have done anything he wanted to do. He could have done. But Mother told him all this early in his life, and she coddled him horribly, believing that he was special in the worst sense of the word. And I mean, it caused incredible hardship for Joe throughout his whole life. She pushed him down to the point where he believed he could not amount to anything. That's what happened to Joe. And so she was always kind of nice to Joe. I mean, they did fight. Everybody fought with her, but she was easier on him. So when he was around, she was a little calmer sometimes, and my whole life was about spending time with Joe. Now, when I was a little kid, his name, there's a funny story about this too. Like, it's not funny, but it is. Joe's name is Patrick, and his name is Patrick Joseph, and he hates that name. And the reason he hates it is because he feels, and it's probably true, I don't know, but there was an individual down in Great Village when they lived there, when he was growing up, a little kid, that was sort of the town simpleton. He was the town idiot, or whatever you want to call it. I don't. It's kind of mean to say that, but that's what they called those people in those times. Was this guy named Tommy Patrickin, and he was a simple-minded guy, but to them he was the village idiot, and which was horrible. But his name was Patrickin, and Joe hated the name, and she named him Patrick. And so as he grew older, he couldn't wait to get rid of that moniker. He never told anybody his name was Patrick. He always said, "My name's Joe." So, like, that was part of his life, he was coming out of a really crappy childhood as well. He'd witnessed things that were horrendous between my mother and father, and his our older brother Dave, which is another section of the story altogether. But Joe became my hero, and I was doing anything I possibly could to impress him. That was the one driving force behind everything I was doing musically, probably right up until the age of 16. I spent 11 years trying to learn things that would impress my brothers. So a lot of my learning was done in secret. And my father was there so little that he was coming home every week, and I was progressing at such a huge rate that he couldn't even believe it. He couldn't believe it. My father would just sit there in the chair, and his eyes would get all full of tears, and he just loved me. I was his favorite, I think. That's what my mother used to tell me all the time. Said, "No, he never loved any of his sons the way he loved you." He was amazed by me because I was just a little kid doing all these things, and it made his day. But I think he was sad inside because he knew he wasn't going to live to see me grow up. That was pretty obvious, as ill as he was and working as hard as he was. So, yeah, the thing with Joe just became an unending attempt for me to one-up myself and one-up Joe. And it was hard to do in the beginning because Joe had a lot more experience as a player than me. And another funny thing that used to happen is my mother called him Patrick all the time, and I couldn't say Patrick. I couldn't say the word when I was a little kid. So I used to call him Pack instead of Pat. Or I used to call him Packy, which, of course, I had no idea at that age was a racial slur. I thought I was saying Patrick. So I'd call him Packy, Packwhack. Packy, I'd be running up to the door to meet Packy when he got home, right? And we all laugh about it now. Because I was just a little kid, I didn't know the difference. But yeah, so it became the bedroom sessions that I used to have with my dad came from the sessions that happened with Joe. Because Joe would go in his room alone, close the door, and practice. And I would, scrape at the door and ask to come in. And sometimes he'd let me in, sometimes he wouldn't. But he was doing that to make sure I really wanted to be in there. And so I'd go in, and sure enough, I'd watch him play. I'd sit across from the bed on a little footstool, and I'd watch him play, and then he'd let me play a little bit, and then that's how it worked. I just every minute that he had a guitar in his hand, I was there. I had to be there. There was just no way around it. I had to be in the room when he was playing the guitar. And so it went with, even in our personal relationship, I was just stuck to that poor man like glue. And, here he was 21 years old and me 5. And he was out trying to have a social life and do whatever and whatnot. And he was coming home to this little kid brother trying to copy everything he did, It must have been amazing, when I look back at what he did for me and all those things, all those musical things. It's just it's a magic time, and life gets in the way sometimes. Me and Joe have had our share of falling outs and arguments, and as adults, as we all do in family, right? But when you take a look at the beginnings of family and see just how incredible the connection is, and the amount of benefit that came from being part of a unit, no matter how dysfunctional, it's amazing to look back on it, 40 years after the fact, 40 and 50 years, But so that was my beginnings, that Sonny James record. And hearing that guitar, the intro for that song, just stuck in my head like nothing else ever had. And of course, I wasn't very old. I didn't have much to compare it to, but I knew I wanted to play it. And I wanted to play it worse than anything. I'll never forget that feeling.
They say for every boy and girl, there's just one love in this whole world, and I know I found mine. The heavenly touch of your embrace tells me no one can take your place.